Good morning. I forgot my tablet, so I'm using my phone today. So, no, I'm not looking at messages or Facebook or anything. This morning, I want to start a new series on Hebrews, if I can get my phone to work. There we go. Now, the book of Hebrews is one that a lot of folks tend to maybe not look at so much because it's kind of hard to understand. There's a lot of Old Testament usage in it, and that's part of why I want to go ahead and preach on it from stage, because I know a lot of us don't make it to the Wednesday night or Sunday morning Bible studies. We're not certain who wrote the book of Hebrews or to whom exactly, because unlike the letters of the New Testament, it doesn't say from Paul to the Corinthians or from James to those in the diaspora or something along those lines. However, there are some things within the book of Hebrews that can give us some evidence of who wrote it, or at least the kind of person they were, and their audience. The author was very, very well versed in the Old Testament and expected their audience to know it as well. Luckily for you, I chose the Old Testament as my concentrations for my degrees. There are 35 quotations from a Greek translation of the Old Testament, 34 allusions or indirect references to the Old Testament, 19 summaries of Old Testament material, and 13 mentions of names or topics from the Old Testament without reference to their context. So the Old Testament is definitely the main source of material for this book. There's good evidence that the author had been a part of the synagogue community. They used concepts, theological concepts, that the synagogue community would have been very familiar with and would have used themselves. The author also refers to this letter as a word of exhortation, which is another name for a sermon, which would be a good reason why there's no opening statement from so-and-so to so-and-so. They're also well versed in the techniques of interpretation used by the synagogue community and the rabbis and things like that. He was highly educated in self-expression and argumentation. The Greek of this letter or sermon is the best Greek of the New Testament. That is the most formal, the highest form of Greek, which means a first or second year Greek student would not want to translate it. I've had a few years of Greek and I don't want to translate it. The rich vocabulary shows that the author was very well read. But who were they? Well, Eusebius quotes Origen for us, and I want to quote Origen. He lived from 185 AD to 253 AD, give or take a few years. And he said, who wrote the epistle? Referring to Hebrews. God knows the truth. So even back then, they weren't sure, and they were trying to figure it out. I like the idea of Dr. James White. He believes that Paul preached Hebrews as a sermon in Hebrew, and that Luke then wrote it down in Greek, kind of like Paul's scribe. His argumentation is that the theology is that of Paul, while the Greek is that of Luke. And Luke and Acts, as far as Greek is concerned, is very close to the Hebrew, or the book of Hebrews. Now, what about the audience? Well, because the letter encourages the audience to not turn away from Christ, and more specifically to not go back to Jewish things, many believe that it was written strictly to Jewish believers. However, this need not be the case. There were many Gentiles who did believe in Yahweh, to the exception of all other gods and goddesses, some of whom fully proselytized, meaning circumcision, dress code, dietary stuff. So the God-fearers are not full proselytes, whereas proselytes would be full proselytes. And it was probably written in the mid-60s, maybe the late 50s at the earliest, a time where persecution of Christians was starting to ramp up. The worst of the persecution, by the way, happened in the 300s AD, right before it stopped. With that, I want to go ahead and read this magnificent sermon because it has a lot to say to us today. So starting in chapter 1, reading verses 1 through 4. God, having spoken long ago to the fathers in the prophets, in many portions and in many ways, in these last days spoke to us in his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the worlds, who is the radiance of his glory and the exact representation of his nature, and upholds all things by the word of his power, who, having accomplished cleansing for sins, sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become so much better than the angels, as he has inherited a more excellent name than they. We start off with a direct comparison to the communication God used in the Old Testament and that which he used during the time of Jesus' earthly ministry. In the past, God had used many different methods of speaking to his people. We see him physically walking and talking with some. With others, he speaks to them through dreams and visions. He sends prophets and angels to speak with them. But then he gave us his Son, who came here and spoke to us directly. The use of these last days indicates that the Christian community did believe the last days had started during their time, probably right after the ascension of Jesus. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they believed that Jesus would be returning in short order. And obviously it's been roughly 2,000 years since he left, and we're still waiting for him to return, and it may be soon. The Old Testament was given to us over a very long period of time. If we go from Moses to Malachi, we're looking at the 1400s BC to the 400s BC. Job might be a little bit older, and Nehemiah might have been written shortly after Malachi, but it's still a pretty long time frame. And it promises a coming Messiah. So we could say then that the Old Testament was given fragmentarily, that is, a bit here, a bit there, and that it was incomplete because the promise it made was not yet fulfilled. Jesus' message was given over a 3-year ministry, and it is complete. We're waiting for his return, but other than that, it's complete. Of course, the New Testament was written over decades, but it was all the message of Jesus and pointing to Jesus. We're then given a list of the Son's qualifications, whom he appointed heir of all things. Psalm 2 is probably in mind here, being alluded to. It'll be quoted later. Jesus, as God the Son, the second person of the Trinity, has indeed inherited the entire creation. He has full authority over that creation. As a matter of fact, he created it, through whom also he created the worlds. The word translated worlds, or maybe universe in your translation, is literally the word ages. So all the time frame, the time-space-matter continuum that we have was created by him. This harkens back to John 1:3, where we see the Word creating all things. And other New Testament writers say much the same thing about Jesus, that he was the creator. The author here connects creation and redemption. If we do not have a correct belief about creation, then we will not have a correct belief about redemption. The two are linked in such a way that they can't be separated. The Son is the radiance of the Father's glory and an exact representation of his nature. The radiance of glory is similar to the Shekinah glory of the Old Testament. Probably the same thing, actually. The Shekinah was something that represented God's observable presence with his people. One thing out of many. In Isaiah 6, Isaiah wrote that the train of the Lord's robe filled the temple. In the Greek translation, known as the Septuagint, the translator put that the glory of the Lord filled the temple instead of the train of his robe. I believe this is probably the glory that the author of Hebrews was thinking about. The exact representation, what does that mean? Well, you and I, we're made in the image of God, right? But we're not exact representations. The Son is exactly like God the Father because he is God, not the Father, but God. Being God the Son, the second person of the Trinity, he and the Father and the Spirit are all of the same essence. Thank you. They share the same being, and they're all of one accord. But they do communicate with one another. They have different jobs to do in redemption, so they are separate in that way. upholding all things by the word of his power. He keeps things running, just as they should be running. Upholding all things is not the same idea as the Greek god Atlas. He's got the earth on his shoulders, kind of hunched over, holding it. That's not what we mean by upholding here. We mean keeping things running like a fine Swiss watch, right? Running the way it should. And through his word is how he does this, just like he created it through his word. He spoke it into existence. And since he is the one preserving it, he therefore has the power to control it and to end it. I think of it this way: if he were to stop thinking about any one of us individually, that individual would cease to exist. If he were to stop thinking about the universe would cease to exist. Now, he came here for a task, and he accomplished that task, the cleansing of sin from his people. And then he went to sit at the right hand of God. We have here the person and works of Christ linked together. Sitting at the right hand of majesty on high shows two things. Firstly, that he himself has this great authority. And secondly, that he is there sitting to intercede for those who believe in him. And the fact that he is sitting shows us that his work is done. The high priest, when they would go once a year into the Holy of Holies to make an offering for sins, there's no chair for them to sit in the Holy of Holies, unless they want to sit on the ark, which is the throne of God, which they would not dare do. But that shows that their work was never really completed. This reminds me, though, of Joseph, who was raised to second in command of all of Egypt. Only Pharaoh was above him. We just read about that not too long ago in our Wednesday night study. Daniel was also raised to a high position. He was raised to the third position, but that's because the guy giving it to him was second in command, and you can't really give him your own position. Now, we've already gotten a lot of theology and doctrine out of these few verses, and I haven't even finished all the verses that we just read yet. The next thing we see is that the Son is higher than the angels and has inherited a more excellent name. The following verses, which I'll read in a moment, will give arguments for this. But I want to say that angel, from the Greek angelos, or the Hebrew malach, means messenger. Right? So it could be used of a human or a divine messenger. But here we have a son, and that's the point. The name that he's given, it's not just a name, like Jesus is higher than Michael or Gabriel as a name. Name here encompasses a lot of different meanings. It's the title, the status, the reputation, right? Jesus has a higher status than the angels do. With that, let's go ahead and read why the author of Hebrews says this, looking at verses 5 through 7. For to which of the angels did he ever say, "You are my son, today I have begotten you"? And again, "I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me." And when he again brings the firstborn into the world, he says, "And let all the angels of God worship him." And of the angels he says, "Who makes his angels winds and his ministers flaming fire." To which of the angels did God say any of this? Now, this is a rhetorical question, not expecting an answer, but wanting the audience to think. I'll give an answer anyway. He said it to none of them. The first quote is from Psalm 2, where Yahweh says that he will put a king in place and call him his son. The second quote is from 2 Samuel 7, where the prophet Nathan is speaking to David, and he says that Yahweh has promised to put one of David's seed, one of his children, on the throne forever. When he brings the firstborn into the world, firstborn, while of course indicating the one who is born first, has a deeper meaning to it. And it doesn't indicate that Christ had a beginning. The incarnation did, obviously, but the spirit within that body had been around for all eternity. Firstborn here has the meaning of the one who will and has inherited the authority of the tribe or household and the largest portion of the family wealth and property. We know, and Nick brought this up in our Sunday morning study, that Isaac is considered Abraham's only son or firstborn son, but technically it was Ishmael, right? But Isaac is the son of the promise. So that's what we have going on here. Let all the angels of God worship him. This comes from Psalm 97. And in its original context, it's talking about Yahweh. Let all the angels worship Yahweh. Therefore, the author of the Hebrews is claiming that the Son is Yahweh. But what about the angels? They're called winds and ministers. They're made into flaming fire. They're powerful, possibly destructive, but they're not sons. They're servants. With that, let's continue verses 8 to 14. But of the Son, he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness above your companions. And you, Lord, in the beginning founded the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain, and they will wear out like a garment, and like a mantle you will roll them up. Like a garment they will also be changed, but you are the same, and your years will not come to an end. But to which of the angels has he ever said, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies as a footstool for your feet? Are they not all ministering spirits sent to render service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation? The first quote here is from Psalm 45. While angels do surround the throne and minister to God, the Son sits on the throne and is ministered to. The Son here is called God. We're told that his throne will last forever, just as God had promised David. We see that he loves righteousness and hates lawlessness. His scepter, a sign of authority, is the scepter of uprightness, right? Meaning good and faithful and true. We are again told that the Son created all things, and that these things will pass away, not because he's not powerful enough to keep them going, but because that's the plan. Right? In Revelation, we're told that a new heaven and new earth will be created, and those ones won't pass away, because everything will be perfect the way it was supposed to be. The point here is that he is eternal. He always has been, he always will be. There will be no end to his days. But to which of the angels? We have this same rhetorical question here again, which indicates that the author is wrapping up this current train of thought. You know, they didn't use headings and subheadings like we do. The final quote is from Psalm 110, which is one of the favorite passages for the New Testament authors to quote. Maybe it's God's favorite passage, I don't know. This text was alluded to earlier. This quote speaks about the enthronement of the Son and the authority that he has. The right hand would have been second in command. The left hand would have been third, because most people are right-handed and they do stuff with their left hand that is unclean. We're once again told that the angels are ministering spirits, right? Here to minister for those who inherit salvation. Well, that would be us, wouldn't it? Because we inherit salvation. God doesn't need salvation. Now, why go through all this hubbubaloo, if you will, about the Son being greater than the angels? Isn't that pretty obvious? Well, in the 400 years from the completion of the Old Testament to the beginning of John the Baptist's ministry, there were a lot of Jewish writings and thoughts on many subjects, one of which was angels. If you do some study on this, you might see it referred to as the intertestamental period, that is the period between the testaments, or as the Second Temple period. Angels were seen as powerful protectors of God's people, put over certain people, and sometimes even individuals. We might refer to that as guardian angels today. The author's audience, therefore, needed to know for certain that the Son was better than the angels, not just one of them, or not just a human who did good things, right? And we need to know that too. Too many people today think that, well, Jesus was just this really good man, really wise, and walked close with God, and maybe because of that, God made him the Messiah. That's not the case. Others think that, well, he's Michael the Archangel, made flesh. A couple different views on that between the witnesses and the Adventists. But Michael the Archangel, he's referred to as one of the princes, not the prince. So I don't think he could be the pre-incarnate Christ. But no, instead, Jesus is Yahweh incarnate, the second person of the Trinity, come to free his people from bondage of sin and to reconcile our relationship with him. I want to go ahead and dive into chapter 2 a little bit. We're going to read verses 1 through 4, and then we'll save the rest for the next time. For this reason, we must pay closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away. For if the word spoken through angels proved unalterable, and every trespass and disobedience received a just penalty, how will we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? That salvation, first spoken of by the Lord, was confirmed to us by those who heard. God also testified with them, both by signs and wonders and by various miracles, and by gifts of the Holy Spirit according to his own will. Today, we have so many different things vying for our attention. Right? We watch TV, movies, YouTube videos, listen to songs, podcasts, audiobooks. People stop us and want to talk to us. We see billboards all over the place. We have commercials and everything trying to get our attention to sell us something. And I don't know about you, but 99.9% of the time, I neither need nor want what that commercial is trying to sell me, and I don't know anybody else who does either. But all of these messages, they're nothing compared to the message of Christ. Now, of course, here in Hebrews, he's talking to his audience, and they've got people trying to get them to go back to Judaism, or maybe even people trying to get them to go worship the Roman and Greek gods or some other gods, right? And, of course, they've still got their wars and rumors of wars and all these things going on as well. But the message of Christ is the one that we really need to pay attention to, because of the fact of what we just read, that Christ is higher than the angels, right? The message of the angels, be those heavenly messengers or human messengers, was unalterable. Right? You can't change the Old Testament. God gave us what he wanted. And every time that message was disregarded, we see it end up in a just punishment. Right? The northern kingdom taken out by Assyria, and a little bit later, the southern kingdom taken out by Babylon because they ignored the message. How much more so if the message of the Son is neglected? Right? What will happen to us? How can we escape that doom from neglecting such a great salvation? Well, we need to not neglect it. We need to pay attention to it and not allow ourselves to drift away. Drifting here is a nautical term, right? I know a little bit about cars, and I've watched Fast and Furious a little bit. And so when I think drifting, sometimes I think of the car drifting around the corners. But that's a controlled drift. This drift here is uncontrolled, right? You're in a boat, and you don't have a paddle, or maybe you're not using it. You're not steering with the rudder. And so you're at the mercy of the winds, the waves, the currents. Maybe you pop up your sail, but the wind's blowing the wrong way. You drift when you aren't paying attention. There are many ways that we can drift in our spiritual walk. It kind of depends on who you are and what you do. Some people, maybe they miss church for a good reason, but then they go on the next week and they're like, I didn't miss church that much. Maybe I won't go this week either. And eventually they just don't go at all. Others, they think, well, I've read the Bible a couple times. I think I'm good. So I'll leave it here on my shelf if I want to read it again, but next thing you know, there's an inch of dust on it. Or perhaps they're listening to some teachers and they find a guy who it really sounds like he knows what he's talking about. He's good at making arguments. He's good at making sense. But they don't take the time to look into those arguments and see, well, is what this person's saying actually true, or are they leading me the wrong way? Those are different ways that we can drift. But also, in our Christian culture today, during Bible studies, sometimes we ask, well, what does this verse mean to you? What is God telling you about this passage? Something I want you to remember. Although the Bible was written for all of God's people, it was not written to all of God's people. It was written to particular people in particular times. Right? If Moses, writing the first 5 books, would not have understood your interpretation, then your interpretation is wrong. Moses knew what he was writing and why, and his audience understood what he was writing. Now, there are some things like Revelation, parts of Daniel, parts of Ezekiel that are what we call apocalyptic, right? And they do predict the future. But there's still things that the writer or the audience at that time would have been able to have some understanding of. Otherwise, it wouldn't have made it in our collection of writings here. Right? Matter of fact, Revelation almost didn't make it in because it was so weird. So instead, we need to ask, what did this mean to the human author and their audience? What was going on back then that could help us understand this more and make more sense of it? You know, the historical, cultural background, and maybe some religious stuff too. What was God really trying to communicate to them, and how then can I apply that to my own life? Right? Because this is for us, but it was written to them. It is most damaging when a pastor or teacher starts to drift away. Because, well, at best, they'll leave the church and go do something else, but at worst, they'll continue preaching. And since they're steering the boat, if you will, the boat full of people, their congregation, will also start to drift. And they won't realize it because they think, well, the pastor is leading us down this way, so it must be fine. Some in the boat will realize what's going on, and they might jump out and swim to another boat that's going the right way, but only if they allow God to lead them and direct them. Of course, those still in the boat at this point in time will think them crazy. Do you not trust the pastor? I've said it before and I'll say it again. Check into what I say about things. Yes, I do a lot of study. I have my degrees. I honestly believe that I am speaking correctly up here, but I'm human. I can be wrong. I can miss something. So check me out, just in case. This salvation first spoken of by the Lord was confirmed to us by those who heard. Lord here probably refers to Jesus. Those who heard would be his disciples. I think more than just the 12. I think the hundreds that he had at that point in time. God himself then testified to these things through signs and wonders and miracles. God here referring to the Father. You know, God used miracles to authenticate his message. We don't see a whole lot of miracles today. I have heard of some miracles in mission context in other parts of the world. A couple of friends of mine, they don't know each other. They went on different mission trips to different places, but they both told me about an incident where they were alone with a native of the country they're in, and they don't speak that language, and the native doesn't speak English. But they're able to communicate for a little brief time, right? That gift of tongues. But it was a short-lived gift. Now, of course, the Spirit, he doles out these gifts as he sees fit for the purposes of the work to be done, back then and today, I think. But we see here Lord, God, and Spirit, right? Or Son, Father, and Spirit. in that order. So we have the Trinity, once again. The Trinity is just packed into these first couple chapters here of Hebrews. Now, in conclusion, I want you to remember that we have a great message which was given to us not by a messenger, but by God the Son himself. Jesus has been shown to be greater than any angel or messenger, and therefore must be God and not a mere human. And we need to take this message seriously and not neglect it. Right? Otherwise, we'll end up drifting from the truth. And drifting from the truth has some pretty dire consequences, which we haven't talked about yet in Hebrews, but we know from other biblical stories we've read. With that, let's go ahead and pray. Lord God, I thank you for your message. I thank you for this author of the book who knew the Old Testament so well and was able to give good, sound arguments for the case he was making, the case that Christ is greater than any other messenger that has come our way because he's your Son, and he is God. He is the initiator of the message, not just someone giving it from someone else. I pray, Lord, that you will help us to remember this and to take more seriously your word and read through it and remember it as well as we possibly can. And help us to go out into the world and talk with those who don't know you yet so we can bring them into your kingdom. Right now, Lord, I pray that you will be with us as we get ready to part ways. And until we meet again, keep us safe. It's in your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen.